On a quiet evening in South Philadelphia, Lily Adams, once a promising singer whose voice once echoed through the halls of community theaters, was now just another tired waitress at Maggie's Place, a little diner tucked between two crumbling brick buildings. No one here remembered the girl who once dreamed of standing beneath Broadway lights. No one asked where she came from or what dreams she'd left behind. They only saw the weary smile, the fraying apron, and the hurried steps between booths. And that was just the way she needed it. Survival had no patience for stories. But everything changed the night Sylvester Stallone walked through the door. Not the Hollywood legend stepping onto a red carpet, not the larger-than-life hero immortalized on screens, but simply a man who, like Lily, knew what it meant to fight battles no one else could see. And it all started with one simple, impossible question. Why 30? South Philly never truly sleeps. Even as the wind blew cold down Passyunk Avenue, the streets hummed with the stubborn life of a city that refuses to be forgotten. But sometimes, even the biggest names, the faces that filled movie posters and lit up marquees, needed a place to disappear. Somewhere worn in, where nobody asked questions, and the smell of strong coffee and grilled cheese felt more real than flashing lights. That night, Stallone stepped into Maggie's Place. No bodyguards, no entourage. Just a thick coat zipped up against the cold and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. The only hint of who he was lay in the way he carried himself. A quiet weight, like a man used to pushing against invisible tides. He chose the booth in the corner, where the cracked vinyl seat sagged a little, but the view out the window showed the streetlights flickering like tiny stars caught in the haze. The bell above the door jangled behind him. No one looked up. That was Philly for you. At the counter, Lily wiped her hands on a towel and grabbed her notepad. Another customer, another order, another hour closer to paying the oxygen rental bill sitting heavy on her kitchen table at home. She didn't recognize him at first, or maybe she did, but some instincts are too tired to believe in miracles. "Evening," she said with a small nod, walking to his booth. Her sneakers squeaked faintly on the worn linoleum floor. "What can I get started for you?" He looked up just briefly, eyes dark and deep-set, framed by lines carved from decades of hard living and harder loving. His voice, when he answered, was low, roughened by time and memory. "Coffee, black." She nodded, jotted it down. "Nothing fancy here, just the basics." He didn't smile. She didn't either. There was a kind of unspoken understanding between people like them, the ones who knew how heavy the world could be. The night wore on. Couples finished late dinners. A few college kids laughed over fries, and two old men argued baseball over burnt pie. The city outside grew quieter, the snow beginning to stick along the sidewalks and the edges of parked cars. Inside, the diner felt like a fading heartbeat. By the time Stallone finished his meal, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, no fuss, the place was almost empty. The jukebox crackled out the last few notes of a 70s ballad. Lily refilled his coffee once, without being asked, then kept her distance. Some customers wanted conversation. Others needed silence, like air. When she finally brought the check, she set it down carefully, like she always did, a silent invitation to stay or go. But she didn't leave right away. Something stopped her. Maybe it was the weight in her chest, the memory of the overdue notice folded up in her apron pocket. Maybe it was the way he had thanked her earlier, not with words, but with a small nod of respect, rare these days. Lily didn't think. If she had, she would have talked herself out of it. Instead, she drew a breath, feeling the worn threads of courage inside her stretch to the breaking point, and said, barely above a whisper, "Would you be willing to tip me $30? The air between them froze. Not because $30 was a fortune, not because the request was outrageous, but because it was real. In the world of waitressing, in the unwritten codes of diners and corner joints, you never asked for a specific tip. Tips were silent, voluntary, a reflection of generosity or the lack of it. To ask was to expose yourself completely. Sylvester Stallone didn't move for a long moment. No flicker of irritation crossed his face. No patronizing smile. No raised eyebrow. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, regarding her with the calm patience of a man who had once stood outside casting offices for hours, with a dream in one hand and rejection in the other. And then, in that same steady voice, he asked, "Why 30? Not accusatory, not skeptical, just curious." The question slipped between them like a bridge half built, daring her to cross. Lily's hands tightened around her notepad. She wanted to look away. She wanted to apologize, to laugh it off, to pretend she hadn't just gambled the last sliver of her pride. But she didn't. Instead, she lifted her chin and said quietly, "My mom's oxygen machine is overdue. They gave us until tomorrow night. $30 closes the gap. Keeps her breathing." Simple, stark, nothing extra. She didn't explain how her mother used to sing to her when she was little. Didn't tell him about the nights spent scrubbing dishes with raw hands. About the off-Broadway dreams folded into storage bins back home. She didn't need to. The truth stood there between them, quiet and unshakable. Sylvester Stallone leaned back in the booth. His expression didn't change. He didn't pepper her with questions. He didn't tell her how sorry he was. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He just reached into the inside pocket of his coat, pulled out his worn leather wallet, and placed 2 crisp 20s onto the table. "No change," he said, voice low but firm. "And no apologies." He stood, adjusted the cap on his head, and offered a brief nod. The kind of nod men give each other in back alleys, in boxing gyms, in life's harder corners. And then he walked out into the snow, leaving Lily standing there, heart hammering against her ribs, holding on to $30 and something far more precious. A small, flickering reminder that sometimes, even in a city as hard as Philadelphia, kindness could still find you when you needed it most. Lily stood there for a long moment after Stallone left, staring at the 2 crisp 20s, lying neatly on the table as if they might vanish if she blinked. The diner's overhead lights buzzed faintly. The neon sign outside flickered in the gathering snowstorm. Slowly, she picked up the bills, folding them carefully and tucking them into the deep pocket of her apron, as if they were fragile. The warmth of the bills against her fingertips felt almost unreal, like a hand extended through the fog of exhaustion that had wrapped around her for too many months. She wiped down the table automatically, not trusting herself to think too much about what had just happened, and finished closing up the diner. Charlie, the night cook, gave her a tired smile as he hung up his apron, and she returned it, albeit weakly. The minutes bled into hours, and by the time she stepped out into the cold night, her sneakers slipping slightly on the icy sidewalk, Stallone was long gone, swallowed up by the streets he had once immortalized on film. The bus ride home was quiet. Only a few scattered passengers sat hunched over in their seats, wrapped in heavy coats, lost in their own battles. Lily pressed her forehead against the cold glass window and watched the city lights blur past. Her mind wasn't on the unpaid bills or the cold that seeped into her bones. It was stuck on that moment, the simple human generosity of a man who owed her nothing, yet gave more than she had dared hope for. It wasn't the money itself that shook her. It was the way he had looked at her when she explained. Not pitying, not uncomfortable, just seeing her, really seeing her. At home, the apartment smelled faintly of peppermint tea and the sharp, sterile scent of oxygen tanks. Her mother, a once vibrant woman, with a laugh that could shake the walls, now lay resting on the worn recliner by the window, a thin blanket pulled up to her chest. The soft wheeze of the oxygen machine filled the silence. Lily set her things down quietly and knelt by her mother's side, checking the tubes and adjusting the settings as the nurse had shown her. Her mother stirred, her eyes fluttering open, still clouded by fatigue, but focusing slowly on her daughter's face. "You're late, kiddo," she rasped, a ghost of her old teasing tone in her voice. "Busy night," Lily whispered, forcing a smile, as she brushed a strand of graying hair from her mother's forehead. "But I made enough. We're covered for the week." Her mother's hand, frail and bird-like, closed around Lily's wrist with surprising strength. "You're doing too much," she said, her voice weak but fierce. "You're supposed to be chasing dreams, not chasing tips." Lily looked away, blinking rapidly against the sting of tears. "Dreams can wait, Ma. Breathing can't." They sat like that for a while, mother and daughter, tethered together by invisible threads woven from love and fear, and 1,000 small sacrifices no one else would ever see. Outside, the snow thickened, laying a soft blanket over the hard edges of the city. The next day dawned. Around noon, while she was shelving a new shipment of used paperbacks, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She slipped it out and frowned at the unfamiliar number. Hesitating only a second, she answered. "Miss Adams?" a voice said, deep and unmistakably professional. "This is Greg Hammond, manager at the Roosevelt Art Center." Lily's heart stumbled in her chest. The Roosevelt was a local institution, a community-driven gallery that sometimes hosted showcases for unknown or struggling artists. But she hadn't submitted anything. She hadn't picked up a brush in over 2 years. Yes?" she said, confused. "We received a recommendation," the man continued, and for a brief moment Lily swore she could hear the smile in his voice. "Said we should check out your work. We'd like to invite you to submit a few pieces for consideration in an upcoming exhibit, Voices of the City. It's focused on overlooked talent from Philadelphia." Lily swallowed hard. "There's been a mistake," she said. I'm not active anymore. I don't have anything recent." "That's fine," Greg said. "Bring what you have, old or new. What matters is the story behind it." The call ended with instructions for a meeting the following week. Lily stood there, the paperback she'd been shelving forgotten in her hand, feeling as though the ground had shifted under her feet. She hadn't told anyone at the diner about her past. She hadn't submitted her name anywhere. And yet, somehow, someone had remembered she existed. The rest of the shift passed in a blur. When she finally stumbled home, she found a small envelope taped to her apartment door. No address, no name. Inside was a single sheet of paper. In firm, unmistakable handwriting were the words, "Sometimes you have to remember who you were to become who you're meant to be. See you at Roosevelt." There was no signature, but Lily didn't need one. She pressed the paper to her chest and let herself smile for the first time in what felt like years. That night, after settling her mother into bed and ensuring the oxygen tank was full, Lily dug through the battered plastic tubs shoved into the back of her closet. Under piles of unpaid bills and old diner uniforms, she found it, her old sketchbook. The edges were worn, the pages yellowed, but as she flipped through the drawings, memories rushed back like a forgotten melody. Faces she had sketched on subway rides, street performers captured mid-motion, a watercolor of Rittenhouse Square. In the fall, the colors vivid and wild. She spread the pieces out on the floor, sitting cross-legged amid them, as the radiator clanked and the snow tapped softly against the window. Each drawing was a breadcrumb, leading back to a version of herself she had nearly lost completely. A knock sounded at the door. She jumped, heart hammering, but when she peeked through the peephole, there was no one there, only a small brown package on the welcome mat. Inside was a set of brand new watercolors, a handful of fine brushes, and a note tucked inside the box. No more excuses. The world needs your voice. Start now. She sank to the floor, clutching the brushes to her chest. She didn't know how Stallone had found her sketches. Maybe he hadn't. Maybe he had simply seen something in her the night before that told him she wasn't just a tired waitress scraping by. Maybe he had once stood at his own crossroads, holding nothing but hope and a battered dream, and recognized the same crossroads in her. She didn't know how it had all come to this. She only knew one thing with crystal clarity. It wasn't over. She still had something left to say, and this time she wasn't going to be afraid to say it. The Lily wrapped her old denim jacket tightly around her and carried her sketchbook and 3 freshly finished pieces in a battered portfolio she hadn't touched since college. The walk to the gallery felt longer than it should have, every step heavy with self-doubt and a tremor of hope so small she was afraid to look at it directly. The Roosevelt Art Center was a converted brick building with tall windows and high ceilings that still smelled faintly of linseed oil and old varnish. Inside, the woman at the reception desk greeted her with a warm smile and a clipboard. Lily handed over her name and was directed to a small waiting area lined with hopeful artists clutching their portfolios like shields against an indifferent world. She sat between a young man with blue-tipped hair and a woman in her 50s whose calloused hands hinted at a life spent sculpting. When her name was finally called, Lily rose, heart hammering against her ribs, and stepped into the smaller adjoining gallery where 3 panelists sat behind a long table. Among them was Greg Hammond, the man who had called her. He smiled encouragingly, but the other 2 members, a woman with sharp glasses and a man with a tired frown, remained impassive. Lily set her pieces on the easels provided, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the angles. She didn't give a rehearsed speech. She didn't try to impress them with grand narratives. She simply spoke the truth, her voice steady but low. She told them about South Philly, about the nights she spent sketching commuters in the subway to feel less alone, about caring for her mother, and how art became the only place where she could still find herself when everything else seemed to slip away. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't beg. She just laid it out bare, the way Stallone had once looked at her. No pretense, no self-pity, just the quiet dignity of someone who had chosen to keep going when it would have been easier to give up. When she finished, there was a long silence. The panelists leaned forward to study her work One of her paintings showed the silhouette of a woman sitting at a diner counter alone, framed by flickering neon lights and the faint outline of an oxygen tank beside her. Another captured the moment a child pressed their face against a bus window, eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and sadness. The third was different, abstract, chaotic, a swirl of muted blues and violent reds bleeding into each other like two worlds colliding. After what felt like an eternity, the woman with the sharp glasses cleared her throat and said, "Thank you, Miss Adams. We'll be in touch." Lily nodded, gathered her things with careful hands, and left without looking back. The cold bit sharply at her cheeks as she stepped outside, but she barely felt it. She wasn't sure whether she had impressed them. She wasn't sure if it even mattered. What mattered was that she had shown up, that she had remembered who she was, that for the first time in years, she had not hidden her truth. That night, back at home, her mother was awake and lucid, sipping weak tea from a chipped mug. Lily sat beside her, recounting the day in small details, laughing softly when she realized she had forgotten to zip up her jacket properly during the interview. Her mother listened, smiling with that familiar stubbornness Lily had missed so much. "You're getting back up," her mother said, her voice raspy but proud, "just like you always do." Lily nodded, blinking back tears. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Maybe she would be accepted. Maybe not. But it no longer felt like the end of the world. She had stitched herself back together out of worn-out dreams and calloused hands, and for now, that was enough. 3 days later, the call came. Greg Hammond's voice on the other end of the line was bright with excitement. "Miss Adams," he said, "the panel was deeply moved by your work. We'd like to offer you a spot in the exhibition. If you're willing, we'd like you to be one of our featured artists." Lily clutched the phone so tightly her knuckles whitened. She barely managed to choke out a yes before sinking onto the floor, laughing and crying at the same time, the sounds startling her mother awake from a nap. They celebrated that night with leftover soup and the last of the Christmas cookies tucked away in the freezer. It wasn't champagne and confetti, but it was real. It was theirs. The night of the opening came faster than Lily could have imagined. The gallery was filled with people, art critics, locals, fellow artists, all milling about beneath the tall ceilings and soft track lighting. Lily wore her best dress, the one she hadn't had reason to pull out of the closet in years. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood by her easels, watching strangers pause in front of her paintings, tilting their heads, studying the emotions etched into every brushstroke. She spotted Greg Hammond talking animatedly to a group near the entrance, and then her gaze caught on a familiar figure moving slowly through the crowd. Sylvester Stallone, wearing a simple black coat and a warm smile, stopped in front of her central piece, the woman at the diner counter. He stood there for a long time, his expression unreadable, then turned and caught her eye. Lily's breath caught in her throat. He didn't approach, didn't make a scene. He simply tipped an invisible hat to her, a small respectful nod that spoke louder than any applause. In that moment, surrounded by strangers, old dreams, and new beginnings, Lily Adams realized something that would stay with her forever. Kindness doesn't need an audience. Dreams don't die quietly. And sometimes the smallest gestures, a coffee shared in silence, a folded note, a simple $30 tip, can become the first steps on a road back to yourself. The night blurred in a whirl of voices and music, and the bright, humming electricity of hope reborn. When Lily finally stepped out into the cold night air, her mother leaning heavily on her arm but smiling wider than she had in months, the city stretched out before them, endless and glittering. Above them, the stars flickered like stubborn little fires, refusing to be extinguished. And somewhere in the distance, past the snow-dusted rooftops and the river running dark and deep, a man who once fought his way into the world with nothing but his fists and a dream had offered another fighter the quiet, priceless gift of belief. And Lily, standing there under the vast American sky, knew with a fierce, grateful certainty that she was no longer forgotten, she was no longer lost. She was alive, she was seen, and she was just getting started.